Perhaps it is due to the massive cultural clash, the way their authorities handle cases, or simply the nature of their most well-known mysteries. But there is always something that pushes us to look to the other side of the world and dig into the darkest parts of its history. Today, we are going to walk through cases of disappearances, impossible crimes, and supernatural events, all under the same premise. None of them have been solved. So, get comfortable and turn off the light, because these are 7 terrifying mysteries of Japan. How is it going? Good morning, afternoon, or evening? Your friend, let's begin. The disappearance of Tiphaine Véron. Let's start in the city of Nikko, located in Tochigi Prefecture, a place surrounded by dense forests, cold rivers, and ancient temples that help create the atmosphere for which it is famous, that of a quiet place. However, under certain circumstances, Nikko can also become truly unsettling. A clear example of this occurred on the 29th of July 2018, when French tourist Tiphaine Véron disappeared without a trace while beginning what was supposed to be the most important trip of her life. Tiphaine was 36 years old and had arrived in the country just 2 days earlier. In 2013, she had been to Tokyo, and since then, she had longed to return with more time to explore the temples, walk through the forests, and immerse herself in the culture that fascinated her so much. She spoke Japanese at a basic level, knowing how to read and write it, and had drawn up a very meticulous itinerary that covered several cities. Although she was traveling alone, she was also very well prepared. Her family's only notable concern was her health issues related to epilepsy, but these had been controlled several years prior, so they did not prevent her from living a normal life. On July 28, she arrived in Nikko and stayed at the Turtle Inn. While there, she shared some photographs with her family. She rested in the afternoon and took shelter due to the passage of Typhoon Jongdari. The next morning, she had breakfast around 8:30 a.m., and it was there that a Japanese tourist photographed her at 8:41 a.m., making this the last confirmed image of the woman, although the hotel owner would later claim that she left the establishment shortly before 10:00 a.m. The phone data told a different story, as the device remained connected to the hotel's Wi-Fi network until at least 10:34 a.m., and some subsequent analyses even suggest she may have remained in the room until 11:40 a.m. Furthermore, it was determined that her phone did not turn off normally, but rather abruptly, as if the battery had been removed or the device had been physically damaged. The following day, July 30, hotel staff entered the room at approximately 10:30 a.m., finding her bed made with Tiphaine's suitcase still there, as well as her passport. There were no signs in the room that she had packed to leave. It was as if she simply hadn't returned. From this point on, the greatest contradictions of this story begin. The room was cleaned and rented out again before the authorities could fully analyze it, and although it is said that luminol detected stains of a substance that could be blood on one of the walls, the official results were never made public. On the other hand, the security cameras were reviewed by the police, but they found nothing conclusive. Later, a backpacker claimed to have seen her at midday walking alone through the forest, something that has not been confirmed, but which coincides with her plans to visit the Shiraito waterfalls and the Takino Jinja shrine. During those first days of the search, the police also located a scarf near one of the rivers in the area, a location that fit the initial hypothesis of an accident. However, that find ended up raising more questions, as the garment did not match any that Tiphaine had brought with her. Even so, the Japanese authorities used that discovery to reinforce the idea that she could have fallen into the water, something her family always considered improbable. It was precisely in that same area where some disturbing testimonies began to emerge. Several Japanese women had reported a man who pretended to be a tour guide to approach them and touch them without permission. In fact, there were warning signs about his presence, and even the authorities themselves acknowledged that this individual existed, although they claimed he was no longer in the region. For the family, this figure of the fake guide represents the most plausible hypothesis of an attack on Tiphaine. A quite chilling fact is that in that part of Nikko, between 2018 and 2022, several bodies, bones, and even a fragmented corpse inside a suitcase were found, in addition to several victims of sexual assaults. While the authorities have denied that these events have any relation to Tiphaine's disappearance, the geographic pattern has fueled many doubts. But the problem goes much further than that, as the investigation by the Japanese police was complicated almost from the beginning. In that country, The disappearance of an adult is not immediately considered a crime. Every year, tens of thousands of people vanish voluntarily under the phenomenon known as johatsu, and if a case shows no signs of violence, the authorities almost never initiate a criminal investigation. Privacy laws in Japan even prevent easy access to a person's most basic data, such as their phone's geolocation, for example. For the Véron family, this cultural clash was devastating. Her brothers traveled to Japan, handed out flyers, appeared on television, pressured the authorities, and hired experts, divers, and search dogs, but they obtained no answers. In France, the story was very different, as the case is opened there under charges of kidnapping and illegal confinement. Several judges, lawyers, and specialists have insisted that an accident is highly improbable. There were no river floods, no belongings were found, nor was there any trace of a fall, and no solid evidence supported the idea that Tiphaine had died accidentally. Nor are there any indications that support a suicide or a voluntary disappearance, as the woman was excited, in constant contact with her family, and had only just begun a trip she had planned for years. Today, more than 7 years later, the mystery remains as intact as it was on day one. There is no crime scene, no clear starting point, and no theory fully fits. Her family has traveled repeatedly to Japan, meeting with investigators, lawyers, and specialists, checking trails, rivers, and forests in search of any sign that could shed light on the case, one that to this day seems impossible to solve. And as long as there are no answers, the same question that her family and friends have repeated since 2018 will remain open, a question that gloomily heads the page they created to find her. Where are you, Tiphaine? The 300 million yen heist. Now let's travel to Tokyo during the 1960s. Back then, the city was growing at an accelerated pace, full of traffic, factories, and student movements that kept the authorities occupied. In the middle of all that noise, Fuchu, a district located to the west of the capital, became, without anyone being able to foresee it, the scene of the most famous and baffling robbery in the history of Japan. Everything happened on the morning of the 10th of December 1968, when 4 Japan Trust Bank employees were traveling aboard a Nissan Cedric, loaded with nearly 300 million yen. This was money intended for the end-of-year bonuses for the workers at the Toshiba factory, and although this amount was enormous, the transfer was considered routine. For that reason, the vehicle did not carry any type of escort, as it had always been done that way. Even so, those on board were tense, as just 4 days earlier, the manager of the Kokubunji branch had received an anonymous letter threatening to blow up his house if he did not hand over part of the money. Following this, the police intervened, checked the residence, and maintained surveillance for hours, but they never managed to identify anyone related to this extortion. With that background, it is not strange what happened near 9 a.m. when a police motorcycle crossed their path, forcing them to stop just a few meters from the Fuchu prison. The officer who stepped down approached firmly. He informed them that the manager's house had exploded and warned them that their vehicle might have dynamite hidden in it. The employees reacted as anyone would in their situation. They got out of the car without questioning it, and the man then crawled under the Nissan Cedric to begin inspecting the underside of the vehicle. A few seconds later, thick smoke began to pour out from underneath. The officer stood up, shouting that they had to run away immediately because the car was about to explode. The employees obeyed. However, when they looked back after running, they heard the car door close and saw it speeding away with the nearly 300 million yen inside. Only then did they begin to understand what had really happened. They noticed the smoke came from a flare on the ground, that the motorcycle was hand-painted to simulate a real unit, and that officer was nothing more than a thief who had executed a carefully studied plan right before their eyes. In a matter of minutes, a single man had managed the most audacious robbery in the modern history of the country. After this, the police launched a massive operation. Minutes after the robbery, there were already roadblocks installed on the main streets. Patrol cars were checking secondary roads, and dozens of agents were deployed in the area. However, the thief had foreseen every move, and just 1.5 kilometers from the site of the assault, he abandoned the Nissan Cedric, transferred the metal boxes with the money into a stolen Toyota Corolla, and disappeared again. That Corolla, in fact, would be found 4 months later, covered with a tarp in a parking lot. Inside were the empty boxes. No one saw who left it there, and no one could determine if the person responsible had acted completely alone, or if another person took the money in a third vehicle. The only thing clear was that the escape route had been as precise as the initial deception, At the scene of the first car, investigators found more than 100 objects, among them bottles, tools, cigarette butts, coins, scraps of cloth, papers, and all of this was arranged in a chaotic manner. Later, it was discovered that what had happened was that the thief had left those things on purpose to saturate the investigation with a pile of useless leads, something that worked perfectly for him. The case quickly became the largest police investigation in the history of the country. More than 170,000 agents participated, 6 million fingerprints were reviewed, and hundreds of sketches were produced. The search, in fact, was so exhaustive that it ended up costing 3 times the amount stolen. Among the first suspects was a 19-year-old, identified by the press as Young S., the son of a motorcycle officer who lived near the area. The police's greatest suspicion was that he did not have a clear alibi. However, just 5 days after the robbery, he took his own life at home by ingesting poison, so the authorities were never able to interrogate him, nor link him conclusively to the case, finally being ruled out because neither his handwriting nor his blood type matched those of the threatening letters. Later, another suspect appeared, a 26-year-old man, detained solely because he looked like the sketch. The police used a minor offense as a pretext to interrogate him. But the next day, a witness confirmed that he had been taking a supervised exam right at the time of the robbery. Although this man was released, his life after that was destroyed, and after a series of financial and personal problems derived from this event, he ended up taking his own life in 2008. Even within the police force itself, there were problems from the start, as the case had been initially assigned to the Homicide Division, which was specialized in violent crimes and not necessarily in units focused on complex robberies or criminal intelligence. In fact, several experts have commented that they firmly believe this administrative error had a direct impact on the lack of progress in the case. Meanwhile, theories of all kinds emerged. Some spoke of local gangs, others of experienced thieves, and others suggested an operation with several accomplices. It was also investigated whether the same author had sent the extortion letters from previous days, and his possible relationship with old threats directed at agricultural cooperatives was even analyzed, but none of this could be proven. Finally, in 1975, the legal deadline for filing charges expired. If the thief was still alive, he could tell his story without facing consequences. Although that never happened, the money never reappeared either. Although the Toshiba employees did receive their bonuses without delay, as that entire sum of money was insured. Today, more than 50 years later, the truth remains hidden. In this robbery, there was no violence, no one was injured, and not a single bullet was fired. But even so, a man managed to disappear with a millionaire amount whose current value would be difficult to calculate, but it would undoubtedly still be enormous. A clean, silent crime, and so meticulously executed that for many, it remains the most mysterious robbery in the history of Japan. The Wednesday Strangler. Saga Prefecture, in the western region of Japan, is a place made up of small towns, agricultural zones, and quiet roads that, at least during the 70s and 80s, would hardly have been associated with a serial killer. However, between 1975 and 1989, 7 women and girls were killed within the same radius of approximately 20 kilometers. These crimes were separated in time, but were united by patterns that, frankly, were unsettling. The most evident, and the one that would end up giving this case its name, was that 6 of the victims disappeared on a Wednesday. The first disappearance occurred on the 27th of August 1975. Tomiko Yamasaki, a 12-year-old middle school student, was home alone when she went out for reasons that could never be determined. Tomiko disappeared without a trace, and despite the efforts of her family and police searches, nearly 5 years passed before her fate came to light. On the 27th of June 1980, while workers were checking a septic tank next to the Suko Elementary School swimming pool in the town of Shiroishi, they discovered a pile of stones accumulated inside, and upon inspecting the place, they found the girl's skeletal remains. This revelation came just 3 days after the body of another victim was found in that same place. It was Ritsuko Yakutake, a 19-year-old young woman who had disappeared on the 12th of April 1980 while she was home alone. Her family had received a letter written in archaic spelling, in which someone stated that she would not return and that they wished for the family to suffer. They also received threatening phone calls, apparently from a young man, On June 24 of that year, her body in an advanced state of decomposition was found floating under a drain cover in the same school grounds where Tomiko would later appear. In fact, Ritsuko was the only victim who did not disappear on a Wednesday. The third case took place on the 7th of October 1981, when Shizuku Kagami, a 27-year-old factory worker, disappeared on her way home. She was found 2 weeks later, on October 21, in a vacant lot in Nabaru. She had been strangled. Unlike other victims, Chisuko was still wearing her work clothes, which caught the authorities' attention when contrasted with the body manipulation present in the other cases. The next crime occurred on the 17th of February, 1982. An 11-year-old girl, whose name was never revealed publicly, disappeared while returning to school, near the same area where Chisuko had been found months earlier. The police organized an immediate search that continued throughout the night and into the early hours of the following day. The girl's body was found behind a mandarin orange field less than 2 kilometers from the place where Chisuko appeared. She had been strangled with a stocking and showed signs of sexual violence. Shortly before the discovery, witnesses had reported a man in his 30s loitering in the area, and a classmate of the girl received a brief call from a woman pretending to be her. The next day, a postcard was received that stated without proof that the girl had been kidnapped for ransom, but that she had been murdered when she caused problems. Although the handwriting did not match the letter sent to Ritsuko's family, the police suspected that the cases were linked. The following murders would not be discovered until several years later, when what is known as the Kitagata incident occurred. Everything began on the 27th of January 1989, when a couple passing by a mountain path in the Kishima district saw something strange at the bottom of a ravine. After getting closer, they noticed 3 female bodies and immediately notified the authorities. The victims were identified as Sumiko Fuchis, 48, who had disappeared on the 8th of July 1987, Kiyomi Nakajima, 50, who disappeared on the 7th of December 1988, and Tatsuyo Yoshino, 37, last seen on January 25, 1989, just 2 days before the discovery. In the 2 km perimeter around the ravine, the police found objects belonging to the 3 women, as if they had been deliberately thrown to confuse the investigation. One of these cases, that of Kiyomi Nakajima, included especially disturbing elements, as a week after her disappearance, her husband and an officer guarding the house received a call from a man who spoke with a strange accent, a mixture of Saga and Kansai. The subject claimed to know the family and said he had found Kiyomi near a mountain pass, nicknamed Yakigome. After that call, both the house and the post office where the husband worked began to receive silent calls, possibly from the same individual. Despite these clues, the police could not establish firm connections. The victims had different ages, diverse occupations, and routines with no relation to each other. They only coincided in the method strangulation in 5 of the 7 cases Wednesday as a critical day, and the geographic concentration. In late 1989, a 26-year-old man who was serving a sentence for minor crimes confessed in a written statement to having murdered the 3 victims from the ravine. However, he later recanted and claimed he had been pressured to sign that document. His confession was inconsistent, and the police found no physical evidence linking him to the crimes. Even so, investigators continued to consider him a suspect for years. In 2002, with the legal time limit about to expire, that same man was formally accused of the murder of Tatsuyo Yoshino. Days later, he was also accused of the crimes against Sumiko Fuchise and Kiyomi Nakajima. The trial began that same year, and the prosecutors requested the death penalty. However, in 2005, the court determined that the confession had no validity, that there was insufficient evidence to incriminate him, and that the police had committed multiple irregularities in the investigation. So, after this, the accused was declared innocent. The prosecution appealed, but in 2007, the Court of Appeals confirmed the acquittal. New mitochondrial DNA tests also did not contribute anything, and from that moment, the case remained completely without responsible parties, and the previous crimes whose legal deadlines had already expired went permanently to the archive. More than 4 decades after the first crime, the Wednesday Strangler remains a ghost in the criminal history of Japan. The combination of girls and adult women as victims, the apparent absence of a motive, the repeated pattern of Wednesdays, and the accumulation of police errors have turned this case into one of the most baffling in the country. 7 lives were taken in silence, without anyone being able to explain who did it, why they chose those days, or what led them to stop. A predator who acted for 14 years and then simply disappeared, leaving behind a puzzle with no solution. Hello, if you are enjoying this content, we have just one small, exciting announcement to make. This coming Saturday, November 29, we will be back at the Guadalajara International Book Fair. We will be doing a book signing at 5 p.m. at booth C22 of El Perseguidor. So, we will see you there. We are very excited to see you once more. So don't miss it. See you this coming November 29, the Kofu Incident. In Japan, there are events that, with the passage of years, transform into modern legends. Some are born in big cities, others in rural areas. And from time to time, a case appears that does not fit into any pattern, and forces us to look twice at an episode that at first glance seemed impossible. That is exactly what happened in 1975 inches Kofu, a common city without a reputation for mysteries, where 2 children claim to have seen something that not only changed their lives, but mobilized teachers, journalists, neighbors, and authorities. Although perhaps the strangest thing was not the story itself, but everything that happened afterward. The account begins on the afternoon of February 23, just before 7. Masao Kawano and Katsuhiro Yamahata, both 7 years old, were skating in front of the Genode housing complex when something bright caught their attention. They were 2 intense orange lights moving in the sky with strange movements that did not seem typical of an airplane. Furthermore, according to the children, these objects emitted a dry, irregular sound, similar to the ticking of a Geiger counter. The first artifact moved off towards Mount Otago, but the second one started descending slowly until it was lost behind a nearby vineyard. The children took off their skates and ran to the place, convinced they were about to see something extraordinary. Upon arriving, they assured that what looked like an orange sphere in the sky was actually a metallic disc about 2 meters high and a little over 4 in diameter, resting on 3 rounded legs. On the hull, they distinguished symbols or characters that neither could recognize. While they were observing, a hatch opened, and a small automatic staircase descended. From it emerged a humanoid figure just over 1 meter tall with long arms in a shiny silver suit and skin, so full of wrinkles that it barely revealed their features. According to the testimony, the only things clearly visible were 3 metallic fangs that protruded from the mouth. Inside the ship, sitting in front of a control panel, another, smaller being seemed to be supervising something. The creature came out to explore the terrain without showing interest in the children, at least initially, for then it turned sharply, headed toward them, and placed a hand on Katsuhiro's shoulder, giving him a couple of pats while emitting a sound that both would later describe as a tape recorder playing in reverse. At that instant, the boy fell to the ground almost paralyzed. Terrified, Masao carried him as best he could and took him out of the vineyard. When they told what had happened at home, their mothers accompanied them to the place. Really, neither of them expected to see anything, but both claimed to have witnessed an orange light pulsing between the rows of grapes, illuminating them as if something were spinning on itself. 5 minutes later, a very intense flash forced everyone to look away, and then the light disappeared. The next morning, the story spread through the Yamashiro Elementary School. The children made drawings, answered questions, and were interrogated by teachers, by the principal Nobuyoshi, and even by the researcher Masaru Mori, a man known within Japanese ufology. The unsettling thing about all this is that everyone agreed. The accounts were exactly the same. There wasn't a single contradiction. Curiosity then led the teachers to organize an inspection in the vineyard. When they arrived, they found 2 concrete posts knocked down and 2 others damaged, in addition to deformations in the metal net that covered the area. Circular marks were also identified in the ground, as if something heavy had descended there. Sometime later, Susumu Maeda, a professor specializing in radiology, took soil samples and ensured that he had found unusually high levels of radiation in the place. Other specialists arrived to corroborate this reading. That same day, other testimonies emerged. An 8-year-old boy, Ichiro Minagishi, said he had seen an orange light moving towards the residential complex about 30 minutes before the encounter. Also, a man from the Kofu Environmental Center stated that his dog alerted him to a bright object that crossed the sky at high speed. Similarly, a Buddhist priest from the Yokoji temple declared having seen a luminous point zigzagging before disappearing into the air. Years later, A woman named Midori recounted that that same night she saw two small figures on the side of a rural road. One of them touched the windshield of her car, wrinkled and completely dark. And with this accumulation of details, the case soon ceased to be just the fantastic story of two children. However, official authorities did not go much further. The Civil Aviation Office declared that the miners had seen something that had been mistaken for an unidentified flying object, but that in reality, they were the lights of a YS-11 plane flying very low. After this, there was no explanation for the humanoid figures, nor for the physical traces in the vineyard, as well as the radiation detected in the ground. Since then, interpretations have ranged from a childish prank that got out of control to the possibility of a farmer working at night with shiny protective equipment. A popular theory, but incapable of explaining the radiation or the coincidence with other witnesses. It has also been suggested that the children, influenced by series like Ultra 7, could have mixed reality with fiction, although this would not clarify how the stories, times, and testimonies of the adults coincided. The curious thing is that over the decades, the story really never changed. In 1982, already adolescents, both returned to the site for a television program and repeated word for word what they had told years earlier. In 2001, under hypnosis and interviewed separately, they coincided again, and today, in their adulthood, they continue to uphold this story. Already 50 years later, the so-called Kofu incident continues to divide opinions. For some, it is the best documented close encounter in the history of the country, but for others, it is a simple children's tale that grew out of control. But beyond what really happened that night, the truth is that no one has managed to fully explain what the children saw, what the teachers found in the vineyard, or what other inhabitants saw in the sky that same night. A mystery that the authorities have stopped investigating, but that continues to fascinate the inhabitants of Kofu who have come to visit this city located in the mountainous region of Chubu. The Hachioji Supermarket case. On the night of the 30th of July 1995, while the summer festival with drums, food stalls, and fireworks was being celebrated in Hachioji, three women were working on something much more mundane, closing a small neighborhood supermarket, squaring up cash registers, and leaving the weekend money ready. Minutes after closing time, someone went up to the second-floor office and executed them with cold, almost professional precision. Nothing was stolen. No one saw the killer leave. And 30-something years later, Japan still does not know who pulled the trigger or why. The victims were Noriko Inagaki, 47, in charge of the night shift, and two high school students, Megumi Yabuki, 17, and Hiromi Maeda, 16. Megumi worked there to save money while dreaming of being a preschool teacher. She liked baseball and going out with her friends to the center of Tokyo. Hiromi was a serious, responsible girl, who that night was not even on shift. She had only stopped by to check her schedule and ended up staying to help close the shop, also to accompany her friend to the festival. That decision, taken almost out of courtesy, left her in the wrong place at the exact time everything went wrong. The Nanpidai supermarket was small but handled good sales, especially on those days. They were in the middle of Obon, the Buddhist festival that honors the spirits of ancestors. So there was a special campaign, and the second-floor safe accumulated the money from an entire weekend. That office was not inside the store, but at the end of an exterior staircase visible from the parking lot, something that had already caught the attention of thieves in the past. That night, it was calculated that there were around 5 million yen in the safe. Around 5 p.m., Noriko arrived at the supermarket in the car of a friend she had agreed to meet after her shift to go to dinner. Megumi arrived by bicycle from her home. As the hours passed, customers decreased. At 6:30, almost all the staff for the day had left. And while the festival music flooded the area, only Noriko and Megumi remained attending to the last purchases. Shortly before 7, Hiromi appeared, who stayed chatting, and upon noticing that closing would fall solely on the two of them, she started to help with the final tasks, like picking up, cleaning, and getting ahead of whatever she could to finish on time and be able to go to the festival. Several witnesses later remembered strange men hanging around the store that afternoon. A middle-aged subject who seemed to wander around without buying anything around 5:30, and another older man who, near 8:30, loitered in the aisles while the girls talked in the checkout area. Although at that moment none of that was enough for anyone to call the police. Almost at 9, the supermarket was about to close. The logs indicate that Hiromi bought some products just before the lights were turned off on the ground floor. and that a couple made the last purchase near 8:56 at night. That couple, driving a white car, has never come forward despite the police's appeals. So, if they were witnesses to anything, they preferred to remain silent. At 9 sharp, the doors were closed to the public. Noriko and the girls finished pulling down the curtains, took the money from the registers up to the second floor, and activated the security system. At 9:15, Noriko called her friend on the phone to ask him to come pick her up, a call that remained recorded. However, according to the subsequent reconstruction, the security system was deactivated just a minute later. The most accepted hypothesis is that upon leaving the office to go, the 3 women were surprised by someone who forced them to go back inside and disconnect the alarm. At 9:17, a pair of students who were passing nearby heard a series of dry sounds very similar to gunshots. But in the middle of the festival, they mistook them for fireworks. At 9:20, Noriko's friend arrived at the supermarket parking lot. He saw lights on upstairs. He waited in his car and assumed she was still changing or closing out accounts. He waited until 9:45, and upon not seeing her come out, he thought that perhaps she was already waiting for him at the restaurant where they had agreed to meet. So he went there. When he arrived at the place and verified that Noriko was not there, the restlessness turned into alarm. So, around 10 at night, he returned to the supermarket, accompanied by a worker from the restaurant. The woman went up the exterior staircase alone and found the office door unlocked. She called out to Noriko without getting an answer, and from her short height, she could not see the full interior of the room. So she returned to the car thinking that perhaps there was no one there. Only when both entered, approached, and looked at the floor, did they understand what had happened. Megumi and Hiromi were lying in front of the safe, with their hands tied and their mouths covered with duct tape, placed face to face, as if they had held hands in their final seconds. Each had a gunshot wound in the back of the head at very close range. Noriko, on the other hand, was leaning against the safe with multiple blows, and at least 2 gunshot wounds to the head. Some sources also mention stab wounds. The blood formed a pool that spread under the feet of the bodies. None of the 3 had had the slightest chance to defend themselves. The scene, as reconstructed by the police, suggests a killer who knew exactly what he was doing. The shots were accurate, despite the weapon used, a Philippine-made .38 caliber pistol, not being characterized as accurate. Experts determined that 5 shots had been fired in total, 2 for Noriko, 1 for each student, and 1 more that left a mark on the safe. It is not entirely clear if the latter was a direct shot at the locking mechanism in an attempt to open the safe, or if it was a ricochet after injuring one of the victims. What did become clear is that the killer did not take any money. The safe remained closed with the millions of yen intact inside, nor were the wallets missing, nor the employees' bags, nor any obvious object of value. In the office, cigarette butts with lipstick marks were found that did not belong to any of the supermarket workers, but DNA tests did not lead to anyone. On the floor, footprints of size 26 shoes, a relatively standard foot size, indicated that a single person had acted. On the other hand, some remains of iron, clay, and moss on the sole made the authorities think that the person responsible could work in a workshop, in a factory, or in the construction sector. From the beginning, the investigation oscillated between 2 explanations. The first, the most logical at first glance, pointed to a failed robbery. The supermarket had been the object of minor assaults in the past, and given the position of the office and the routine of the employees carrying money up the exterior stairs, it was not difficult to imagine that someone had decided to take advantage of that festival day with half the neighborhood distracted by the music to attack right after closing. When the safe was full, something went wrong in this scenario. The thief lost patience, could not open the safe, and decided to execute the witnesses before fleeing. However, over time, the investigators themselves began to lean towards a second possibility, a crime motivated by grudge or score. Settling, in which the robbery scene would be just a facade. Noriko, who had been working at the supermarket for only a month, had a past that was talked about a lot after her death. She had worked as a hostess in nightclubs, had managed her own restaurant, and, according to some reports, maintained close relationships with men linked to environments of illegal gambling and potentially organized crime. She was a woman of strong character, of whom it was said she could win over loyal customers but also lasting enemies. Months before the crime, she had received at least 1 threatening letter with a box cutter blade included, and a very direct message. If she continued on that path, her life was in danger. If the killer had her as the primary target, That could explain the additional violence that some sources describe on her body, as well as the fact that the shots at the girls were fast, accurate, almost impersonal, while Noriko also presented signs of previous blows. In that context, shooting at the safe or pretending to try to open it would serve to divert tension towards a supposed frustrated assault. Even so, neither of the two theories has been able to be proven. The investigation accumulated clues, suspects, and dead ends. On the duct tape used to immobilize Megumi and Hiromi, it was possible to isolate a partial print many years later, and upon comparing it with millions of records, the police found an 8-point match with a Japanese man who lived in the Tama area. He worked as a taxi driver and owned a white car, similar to the one seen near the supermarket. He already had a history of a minor robbery, and some believed they saw the perfect profile there. The problem was that the match did not reach the 12 points required by law to be considered a conclusive identification. Furthermore, the man died in 2005, and to make matters worse, the DNA tests taken from his relatives did not match the biological material found at the scene. Another line of investigation pointed abroad. A Chinese man linked to a gang that had committed robberies in Japan was signaled from prison in China as someone who supposedly knew the author of the triple murder. Years later, that man, Liang, ended up in Canada, and although Japan managed his extradition, they only did so under charges related to fake passports, since legal resources prevented interrogating him directly about the Hachioji case. So he served his sentence, was deported, and the police have never publicly acknowledged linking him solidly to the crime. Meanwhile, the years kept passing. The supermarket changed its name, then closed, and was finally demolished. In its place, there is now a parking lot and a small plaque in memory of the victims, since Japanese law eliminated the statute of limitations for crimes punished with the death penalty. This case, at least on paper, will never be closed. The reward for useful information has been renewed several times, and today amounts to 6 million yen. Each anniversary, agents who hand out flyers at the Hachioji station repeat the same request. If someone saw something, if someone knows something, speak up. But 30 years later, no one has. There are no new fingerprints, no confessions, no DNA matches that change the course of the case. Only questions remain about whether the killer was a nervous thief or a hired hitman, someone from Noriko's circle, or a stranger who chose at random right that night. The triple murder at the Hachioji Supermarket remains one of the most unsettling open wounds in the criminal chronicle of Japan, a case in which everything seems to indicate that the person responsible knew exactly how to arrive, how to kill, and how to disappear, and in which also, for now, the only certainty is that no one stopped them as they left by that exterior staircase. The curse of the Nakagusuku Hotel. In the mid-1970s, Okinawa was preparing to receive a wave of tourism. The 1975 Oceanographic Expo promised thousands of visitors and a unique opportunity to turn this island into an international destination. It was in that climate of economic enthusiasm when a businessman from Naha, whose name has not been revealed, decided to push a very ambitious project, a luxury hotel built on a hill with views of the Pacific and the East China Sea, a few meters from the walls of the historic Nakagusuku Castle. The plan seemed perfect on paper, as the terrain offered spectacular panoramic views and was close enough to the castle so that visitors could tour both sites without any effort. But from the beginning, warnings appeared. Monks from the nearby temple and neighbors of the area insisted that this hill was full of ancient tombs, shrines, and sites considered sacred since time immemorial. The dense vegetation that covered the place hid family burials and funerary monuments that formed part of the spiritual landscape of the region. And according to these voices, intervening in that space was an act of arrogance destined to bring misfortunes. However, the businessman ignored all the warnings, and construction began quickly. But the works then began to record some unusual accidents. Tools that fell from heights without explanation, serious injuries among the workers, and persistent rumors that some had seen figures among the undergrowth or heard voices in the concrete corridors that were not yet finished. With the passing of days and weeks, many workers began to abandon the project, convinced that that place was cursed. The hotel had been conceived as a huge recreational complex that would include a water park, an interactive zoo, a nightclub, and various facilities spread out as if they were a small tourist town. However, all this remained merely a skeleton, since in 1975, just when it had to be inaugurated, construction stopped completely. Depending on the version of this story, the reason was either the sudden bankruptcy of the contractor, political conflicts due to the proximity to the castle that aspired to become protected heritage, or the growing resistance of the community and the workers themselves. For some historians, this economic and administrative explanation is the most plausible of all. Even so, the legend quickly gained strength, and one of the most repeated stories ensures that the owner tried to prove that there was nothing supernatural at the site, so he slept inside the unfinished building for several nights. But according to the rumors, he ended up losing his sanity and was interned in a psychiatric hospital where his trail became confused. Other accounts state that he disappeared shortly after, or that he ended up taking his own life there and that his spirit continued to wander among the collapsed corridors. And although none of this is documented, it is part of the myth that became inseparable from the place. Over time, the complex was completely abandoned. The structure was left exposed to humidity, typhoons, and the constant invasion of the jungle, which ended up devouring corridors, rooms, and roofs. Part of the site was declared a dangerous zone due to collapses, and for years it was even prohibited for U.S. military personnel after an incident in which a soldier was seriously injured when a floor gave way. Despite the warnings, some urban explorers, photographers, or curious people continued to visit the site. Inside the building, graffiti coexists with remains of the water park, rusted kitchens, rooms where the architecture seems twisted or incomplete, as if the place had been interrupted in the middle of an idea. Further away, among the undergrowth, there are still the ancient tombs and a small mausoleum covered in vines, the same ones that fueled the legend that the spirits never approved of the presence of this hotel. The abandonment continued for decades until finally the structure was demolished in its entirety. Today, nothing of the place remains, but the hill preserves a particular silence, and many inhabitants of Okinawa still prefer not to walk around there after sunset. Perhaps out of respect for the tombs, perhaps because of the stories that grew near the hotel, or perhaps because some places, even when they have disappeared, do not finish going away entirely. The case of Miyako Hiraoka. We are going to close this video with one of the most tragic cases on the list. A painful, devastating story in every detail, but that also holds an unsettling element, as it is one of the few cases of this kind in Japan that includes audio-visual evidence of something very strange. Miyako Hiraoka was 19 years old and studied at the University of Shimane Prefectural. She was a responsible young woman, with good grades and a future headed toward social service. She dreamed of traveling to developing countries to help vulnerable communities and participated in volunteer activities since she entered the university. In April 2009, she moved from Kagawa Prefecture to the student dormitory in Hamada, a quiet city by the sea where news rarely talked about violent crimes. In addition to her studies, Miyako worked part-time at an ice cream parlor inside a small shopping center in Minato-machi. To get to and from work, she covered about 2 kilometers on foot daily, a journey that became especially uncomfortable at night. Between the shopping center and the dormitory, there was a stretch almost without houses, with a path lined by trees, scarce lighting, and very little presence of people. Some companions accompanied her on occasions, but when that did not happen, Miyako had to cross the place completely alone. Over time, that path started to generate an uneasiness increasingly difficult to ignore. Her parents knew that she did not feel entirely safe. They had spoken on the phone about the subject, and Miyako commented to them that she was thinking of quitting work in a few days to look for something closer. She planned to do so on October 28, although she never reached that date. On the 26th of October 2009, Miyako completed her workday. The shopping center's security cameras recorded her around 9:15 at night, closing the ice cream parlor, gathering the trash, and leaving through the staff door with a bag of waste in her hand. This would be the last time she would be seen alive. Outside, the street was quiet, with no pedestrian traffic. At some point between the shopping center and the path to the dormitory, Miyako disappeared. The next day, she did not show up for classes, nor did she return to the ice cream parlor. Her boss tried to call her, but her phone was off. He checked her file, found her parents' number, and contacted them to ask if they knew anything about her. They, who were used to speaking with their daughter practically every day, had also not managed to communicate since the night before, so they immediately began to worry. They called the university dormitory where they were informed that Miyako had not returned. From that moment, the family moved to Shimane and officially reported her disappearance. Hamada was a small city, and the news of a missing student spread rapidly. Posters with photographs were placed. The police patrolled the journey between the shopping center and the university, and the authorities recommended that students not go out alone at night. The university even advanced the return time to the dormitories, and for a few days, the path that Miyako used to cross became a kind of invisible border that many preferred to avoid. However, just 11 days later, on November 6th, the story took a turn as brutal as it was definitive. A man who had gone out to pick mushrooms on Mount Garyu thought he saw among the leaf litter what looked like a particularly large mushroom. When he leaned over to see it better, he realized it was a human head. With no signal on his phone, he had to descend part of the path to get coverage and notify the police. DNA analysis soon confirmed what was feared. The head belonged to Miyako. Near that place, in the following days, investigators found other parts of the body: a torso without limbs wrapped in plastic, a femur fragment, an ankle, tiny remains mixed with animal excrement, and various indications of burns on the skin. Furthermore, some internal organs and other limbs were missing. A scene compatible with a crime committed there was not found, so the conclusion was clear. The assault and the dismemberment had occurred in another place, and Mount Garyu had only been used as a dumping ground. The state of the body and the way it had been dismembered resulted in being so disturbing that even within the police, they spoke of an exceptionally cruel crime. Hypotheses were thrown around that ranged from a suspect with some experience in handling knives to the barely suggested possibility that part of the remains had been devoured by animals or manipulated deliberately to hinder identification. The only thing certain was that Miyako had been murdered and that her death had not been quick nor accidental. From that moment began one of the most extensive investigations in the recent history of the region. Due to the fact that the body had appeared on the border between two prefectures, the police of Shimane and Hiroshima formed a joint team. Witnesses were tracked down, security cameras were reviewed, bus schedules at night were analyzed, and a vehicle circulation pattern near the shopping center on the night of the disappearance was inspected. A witness mentioned having seen a young woman getting into a white sedan-type Toyota similar to a Mark II, although he could not remember the license plate. A plastic fragment was also found adhered to the body that seemed to correspond to the sleeves used to pack phone directories. The clue led to a complex investigation regarding the suppliers of that material, but it turned out to be too broad, as similar bags were distributed in several cities, so this did not lead to anyone in particular. In parallel, a profile of the aggressor was developed. It was believed that it could be a man between 20 and 40 years old who knew the area well and probably lived alone in a place isolated enough to commit the crime, dismember the body, and keep it hidden for several days before moving it by car towards the mountain that was relatively far away. For years, vacant houses were searched. Hunters, butchers, surgeons, ex-military personnel, customers who had bought certain types of knives were interrogated, and even people who rented extreme horror movies were investigated, but the results always ended in a dead end. The magnitude of the effort was enormous. With the passage of time, talk was made of more than 300,000 police interventions between interrogations, patrols, and searches. A reward of 3 million yen was offered for useful information. Leaflets were also distributed during each anniversary of the disappearance, and in 2010, that day was declared as the Day of Life, Safety, and Tranquility in Shimane Prefecture, as a reminder that the case remained unsolved. And it was right here, in the middle of this atmosphere of fear and helplessness, that an element emerged that would turn the story into something more than an atrocious crime. During one of the television reports carried out near the place where Miyako had disappeared, a local chain recorded a night segment live. In it, the reporter is seen in front of the camera talking about the case, while the area around him remains silent. However, upon reviewing the audio, some viewers claim to hear in the background a very faint female voice. At first, it seemed like simple noise, a murmur between the wind and the static of the microphone. But upon increasing the volume and isolating the fragment, several heard a crisp phrase in Japanese that could be translated as, "It hurt a lot. Why only me?" There were no women near the reporter at that time, nor in the team that was on frame. That brief sequence started to circulate on mystery programs and specialized forums, and little by little, the idea began to consolidate that the voice could belong to Miyako, trapped in some way in the place where her tragedy had begun. Over time, alternative explanations arose. Some technicians assured that the phrase could actually be a different expression, something like, "It was very terrible," pronounced by a police officer or an employee who was off camera, but close enough to the microphone to sneak into the recording. Others suggested that someone from the television station could have played a prank in poor taste, taking advantage of how sensitive the subject was. None of this could be fully confirmed, and the audio ended up occupying the same place as so many phenomena of this type, halfway between rational interpretation and restlessness. Meanwhile, the case seemed condemned to remain faceless. For 7 years, there was not a single solid suspect. However, in 2016, technology that in 2009 was not available changed the landscape. The authorities decided to apply new license plate reading systems on old traffic and surveillance camera recordings. Upon doing so, they detected a car that until then had gone unnoticed. A white Toyota circulating during the night of the disappearance along the same route that Miyako had to follow, and later also in the Mount Garyu area. The vehicle belonged to Yoshiharu Yano, a 33-year-old man originating from Yamaguchi Prefecture. His life, at least in appearance, did not stand out too much. He had been a good student, a judo practitioner, and an amateur musician, but in the early 2000s, he had accumulated a record for crimes committed in Tokyo, where he threatened several women with a knife. He was sentenced to 3.5 years in prison and released in 2008. Shortly after, he got a job at a solar panel company, where he stood out so much in sales that he ended up being transferred precisely to the Shimane area to expand the business. His work routes regularly took him near the shopping center where Miyako worked. Upon reviewing his history, the police discovered something disturbing. He did not show up for work the day after the young woman's disappearance, and he was also absent when her body was found on Mount Garyu. That alone was not conclusive, but there was an impossible detail to ignore, and that is that Yano had died 7 years earlier, just 2 days after the discovery of Miyako's head. On the 8th of November 2009, he and his mother were in a car on a highway in Yamaguchi Prefecture, on their way back from visiting the grave of Yano's father. According to the reports, the car crashed several times against the protective barriers, stopped, and ended up engulfed in flames. When emergency services arrived, they found the vehicle charred and the bodies of both occupants outside the car on the pavement. There were no signs of mechanical failure or braking marks that would indicate an attempt to avoid the impact. Both Yano and his mother had managed to get out of the interior before the fire reached them. But for some reason, they did not flee. They did not ask for help, nor did they get far enough away and ended up dying from the burns. For years, that accident did not seem to have any relationship with Miyako's case. Only when the investigation regained strength did the pieces start to fit together. The police searched Yano's former home and examined his belongings, among them a digital camera and a storage device that had partially resisted the fire. It was thus that a group of specialized technicians managed to recover 57 images that had been deleted. What they saw in them allowed them to finally close the circle. More than 40 photographs showed Miyako inside a bathroom that was identified as that of Yano's house in Masuda. In some, she was alive, tied up with signs of violence. In others, the signs of her death and the subsequent dismemberment process were clearly appreciated. A knife also appeared, and at certain angles, parts of Yano's own legs, which allowed him to be physically placed at the scene. The other evidence, including the coincidence of the vehicle, his work absences, and hundreds of ambiguous comments he had made to colleagues about having done something terrible, finished cementing the accusation. In December 2016, the authorities officially announced that the case was resolved and identified Yoshiharu Yano as the person responsible for the kidnapping and murder of Miyako Hiraoka. Given that he had been dead for years, the prosecution decided not to file posthumous charges. In March 2017, the reward was paid anonymously to 3 people who had provided key information. For Miyako's family, that represented a limited form of closure. They finally knew the name and face of the killer, but they would never hear a confession nor an explanation, much less remorse. For many Japanese, however, the story did not end there. The nature of the crime, the way in which the suspect died just 2 days after the discovery of the body, the absence of a clear technical cause in the accident, the strange decision not to seek help when the car caught fire, and of course, that voice recorded in the live night broadcast on television, fueled a different interpretation. In forums, documentaries, and mystery programs, the case began to be described as the revenge of a spirit in Shimane, a way in which Miyako's pain could have found an answer outside any court. While some skeptics have provided rational explanations for each element, there is a persistent feeling that in this account there is something more, something that cannot be documented in a police report nor archived alongside the recovered photographs. The truth is that Miyako Hiraoka never had the occasion to defend herself, nor to ask for help in time, nor to choose a safer path that night. Her life stopped on a dark stretch between a shopping center and a university dormitory, and ended up abandoned on a distant mountain. We hope these mysteries have been to your liking. Remember that you can always leave us a comment and a like to support us in reaching more people. Also, remember to follow us on our social networks where you find me everywhere. With nothing more to say, I bid you farewell. See you later.